Right. Well, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending where you are in the world. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is John Bachtler. I'm a director of the European Policies Research Centre at the University of Strathclyde and at the Technical University of Delft. We're delighted to see you and to welcome you to our European Policy Research Seminar Series. Of course, until about 15 months ago, this would have been a physical meeting, usually at the University of Strathclyde, but the advantage of online meetings is that we can welcome you from wherever you are. We're delighted to have two eminent speakers today, Austin Kilroy from the World Bank and Roberto Ganau from the University of Padua and the London School of Economics. Welcome, Austin and Roberto. Really pleased to have you with us. Austin and Roberto will be sharing their research and findings on the topic of detecting economic growth pathways in EU NUTS-3 lagging regions. Some of you may well have seen the report that they published. I think it was in December of last year. Their presentation will be around about 30 minutes, and we'll then open the floor for questions and comments from the audience. If you'd like to make an intervention when we come to the discussion, please use the blue hand function, but feel free to make contributions in the chat as our speakers make their presentation. Before introducing our speakers, I'd just like to remind you that this meeting is being recorded, which means that you and others will have the opportunity to follow the meeting at a later stage. And the recording will be made available together with the presentation on our YouTube channel and shared with you by email. Please feel free to share your thoughts also on Twitter and spread the word on the research, the important research that Austin and Roberto will be presenting. Let me say a few words about each of our speakers. Austin Kilroy is a team leader and senior economist in the finance, competitiveness and innovation global practice of the World Bank Group. He joined the bank in 2010 and has led lending analysis and technical assistance projects in Europe, Africa and Asia. Currently, he's coordinating a multi-sector team of 90 people focusing on regional economic development in Eastern Croatia. And he was just saying that he would normally be based in Zagreb. He has a PhD in regional and urban economics from MIT, where he was a Fulbright scholar, and an MA from the University of Cambridge in the UK. Roberto Ganau is assistant professor of economics at the Department of Economics and Management Marco Fano of the University of Padua, where he obtained his PhD. He's also a research associate in the Department of Geography and Environment of the London School of Economics and Political Science. And his research focuses on regional economics, the economics of institutions, and international economics. So welcome again, Austin and Roberto. The floor is yours.
John, thanks very much. That's great. So we're going to be splitting the presentation. I'll take the first bit and then Roberto. And I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully you can see it. Do you see the screen? Okay, I can see thumbs up. Right, good. So we hope that we're going to stimulate a bit of discussion today. That I saw someone, I think, was asking in the chat about if they can read the working paper online. So I was just about to send the link, and then it's time to start the presentation, but we can certainly circulate that. Maybe Roberto can do it while I'm speaking. So the paper in a nutshell, or the research in a nutshell that we did, was to analyze correlates of growth at the NUTS-3 level in the European Union. We looked at the 28 member states, so this was pre-Brexit, and for reasons that we detail in the paper, we looked at 1,321 NUTS-3 regions. So that's almost all of them, but not quite all because of data availability on some of the regions. We focused particularly on industrial structure, innovation, agglomeration, and inward foreign direct investment, because we're interested in understanding the essentially how growth looks, or what growth looks like in each of those regions. And we cover a long run period of analysis from 2003 to 2017. The contribution of the paper is somehow at the conceptual level. So we propose a new taxonomy for lagging regions, where we combine a couple of taxonomies that have been used before, one for lagging regions and catching up work, and one for different income levels of regions in the EU. So we combine those together so it's possible to compare lagging regions with non-lagging regions. And we explore econometrically the correlates of growth for low income versus low growth lagging regions. So these are two different types of lagging regions that we were keen to look at. And the key insights of the paper are that, number one, we find that different factors of growth are driving different types of regions, and also that maybe policymakers can be informed on those patterns in their type of region. So we are, well, I think you'll find out a lot more from the rest of the presentation. So the presentation is going to be in 4 parts. The motivation for the work. So this is the kind of policy relevance of the work. Secondly, the framework that we're using for the analysis. Then the analysis and results, and then the policy implications. And we hope to hold your attention throughout the presentation, that you'll be on the edge of your seat. But we've already given the punchline, so we might have given some of that away. But we hope that that'll make you more interested in the detail of what we're about to present. So the motivation first. The motivation is clearly heightened by the huge budgets that are spent on regional development in the EU. As I think most people dialing in know, and as we summarize in the paper, there are huge budgets for cohesion policy. And this is one of the things that I found most surprising when I was moving back to the European Union from other countries around the world. Just the magnitude of the budgets that are spent on this kind of initiative is really mind-blowing. And it seems to have been increasing over time through the different financing periods. But there's a bit of a paradox here, because when you look at performance in terms of inequality, the picture is quite mixed. So here on the graph, you can see 3 lines. You've got the solid line, which is the coefficient of variation in GDP per capita between the 28 member states. And you can see that inequality has declined over time. So in essence, the EU has been a convergence machine in the time period that we're looking at, where countries have become, the income level of countries has become closer to each other. However, when you look at the dashed line, which is across NUTS-3 regions, so this is variation in income across NUTS-3 regions, across the period, with some exception in the middle of the period, it seems to have been rising. And particularly within countries, that's this sort of weirdly dashed line at the top of the 3 lines. Within countries, inequality has been rising most consistently. So this is inequality across NUTS-3 regions within each of the 28 countries, excluding Cyprus and Luxembourg, because they were too small to do this analysis. So we have a bit of a paradox here, that there are these huge budgets, we've got convergence across at the country level, but we've got rising inequalities within countries. And this is a bit of a mystery to try to explain. Another part of the motivation is that lagging regions are a widespread problem, and this is sort of the flip side of the coin. It's another way of looking at the same trend. So here, just to put it all on one graph, you can see the income level on the y-axis and the growth rate on the x-axis of all of these NUTS-3 regions in the sample, 1,321 regions. And so you might notice a few things there. And by the way, I think there's a small typo on the y-axis. It might be thousands of euro, not billions of euro, because this is per capita. So I think you can see that the lower income regions, those ones at the bottom of the graph, have tended to grow fastest. But there is a lot of variation. And even as you rise up the graph vertically towards regions with higher income, there's still quite some variation. So there's some variation to be explained there. We can also see here that within country variability in income it is different in each country, but tends to be, quite high. So in each of these countries, you can see here that there are essentially this is a plot of the growth rate in each country, and that's the average from 2003 to 2017. So you can see there's quite a spectrum of growth rates in each region in the country. We've split it into the EU 15 on the left and the post-2004 enlargements on the right. And you can see large variations in larger countries like Greece, the UK, Spain, and also in smaller countries in the EU 15 like Ireland, Belgium, and others, and in post-2004 enlargement countries. So the point to make here is really that lagging regions are quite a widespread problem in the EU. This is not a sort of niche problem. It's really affecting a lot of the EU member states. And then the third part of the motivation for our research is to some extent that lagging regions are a hidden problem. So we noticed that a lot of the existing analysis is done at the NUTS-2 region level. And of course that makes sense because a lot of programming of EU funds is at the NUTS-2 region level. But the picture gets even more interesting when you look within the NUTS-2 regions, at NUTS-3 regions. And here on the map, you can see plotted that the black lines, the black border lines are NUTS-2 regions. And then we've also plotted the growth rates of NUTS-3 regions within each of those NUTS-2 regions. So you can see that there's beginning to be some differences in growth rates, even using these kind of blunt color categories. You can see there's some heterogeneity within NUTS-2 regions. And just to give some examples there, so Emilia-Romagna, which everyone knows is quite a wealthy region in northern Italy, includes Bologna and household names of some very delicious foods, but also includes some quite disadvantaged or struggling small regions like Ferrara. And they're obviously working on that at the moment, but this is the economic situation as it exists. In Croatia, until very recently, one NUTS-2 region includes the richest part of the country, Zagreb, and also 5 of the poorest counties in the whole of the European Union, and that's in one NUTS-2 region. In Bulgaria, you have a similar phenomenon, which we detail in the paper. In Germany too, so that this is something that we can notice across quite a lot of the European Union. So the point here is that lagging regions are sometimes hidden by analysis that takes place at the NUTS-2 level, and it may be important to look at what's going on at NUTS-3 level. And then finally, the policy motivation of this. I think, John, I'd be interested in your take on whether this is true, but I think we're noticing that there's increasing attention of European policymakers towards the NUTS-3 level. When you look at things like integrated territorial investments and these kind of new instruments, some of that is taking place either at the NUTS-3 level or in a couple of NUTS-3 regions together or multiple NUTS-3 regions. But it is below the NUTS-2 level. And at the same time, there is a lack of evidence and guidance for what to do at the NUTS-3 level when it comes to economic policy making and economic investment, public support for economic development. There's a lack of guidance and evidence about what to do. And there are only a few examples of turnaround, especially for lagging regions. There's only a few examples of turnaround amongst similar lagging regions. So all together, we hope we've made the case, for why this is really important to look at the NUTS-3 level and to do whatever we can with the data that's available. So just to recap, large government spending with mixed and unevenly distributed results, need for a better understanding of the dynamics of regional economic growth. The NUTS-2 level hides quite a lot. That's why we're focusing on the NUTS-3 level. and there's quite an urgent need for evidence on what works. So that, with all of that, we arrive at our key research question, which is what can be learned about regional economic growth at the NUTS-3 level that can inform policies and investments. And now I'm going to turn over to Roberto.
Yes, thank you. Let me share the screen. Okay, let's do this. Okay, thanks a lot. So let's move now to look at the framework of the analysis and the empirical analysis somehow in detail. Well, let's come back a bit for details about why NUTS-3 regions can be problematic for analyzing economic growth. So as Austin was saying, NUTS-3 regions are very large units and they can somehow hide a lot of variation across NUTS-3 regions. And the story is that when we take NUTS-3 regions, we do find that within the single NUTS-3 regions, we do have a lot of heterogeneity across NUTS-3 regions. This heterogeneity is such that we do find urban places, rural places, fast and slow regions, rich and poor regions, as was the case of Bologna and Ferrari in the Emilia-Romagna Italian region. And the point is that all this substantial variation within NUTS-3 regions can make somehow problematic to get some reliable conclusions about what works for economic growth, because we are forgetting about all this heterogeneity. So our idea, starting from this evidence, is to take somehow the NUTS-3 lens to lower the geographical scale of analysis in order to get a more precise picture of what is going on. Simply because NUTS-3 regions are at the same time smaller units, less internally heterogeneous than NUTS-3 regions, but at the same time, they are also quite heterogeneous in terms of economic performance. That's why we are observing and looking at fast and slow growing NUTS regions, while rich and poor NUTS regions within the same larger units. So just to convince you that this is the case, so in these slides we can see in the first table, we do have population distribution at NUTS-3 and NUTS-2 level. This is mean value over our period of analysis, 2003-2017. And we do see that NUTS-3 regions are indeed much less different than NUTS-2 regions. This is smaller variation in terms of size, so in terms of scale of these spatial units for analysis. But at the same time, these similar regions are also present also lots of variety in terms of economic growth performance. So on the second table, we do have average early GDP per capita growth rate at the country level, NUTS-2 level, NUTS-3 level. So as we were saying at the beginning, countries have somehow converged for a kind of European Union average, and over the period of time we do consider, and remember that here we do have all the 28 countries, we can record an average of 4.2% GDP per capita growth. When we look at NUTS-2 and NUTS-3 regions, well, there is not such huge variation, okay? We do have something like 2.9% growth rate for NUTS-3 region, 2.8% growth rate for NUTS-3 regions. But then if we unpack NUTS-3 regions, and we take as an example, as just one source of heterogeneity, the topology of region in terms of rural versus urban type, and we further disentangle considering just the 28 capital city regions, now we can see that essentially almost all the economic growth reached by the European Union has been driven by these 28 capital city regions with something like 4.4% growth rate, followed by rural region and then the remaining urban regions, which just recorded 2.6% growth rate. So there's a lot of heterogeneity, okay? So this is just to convince you about our story. And drawing from this, what we do empirically, and the first contribution of the paper is to propose kind of a novel taxonomy for to be applied at the NUTS-3 level, but a taxonomy that, of course, could work also at the NUTS-2 level, and a taxonomy that aims at identifying different regional profiles in terms of economic performance and economic capacity, in some sense, economic growth potential. And we did this by combining two well-known classifications. The first one is the standard cohesion policy taxonomy at the NUTS-2 level that classifies regions according to their income level, GDP per capita level. And the second one is the catching gap classification, the taxonomy that has been proposed by the European Commission in 2015 under the Catching Gap Initiative. So an initiative that was focusing essentially that was taking as target particularly lagging regions, identifying two different types of lagging regions. The first one was made by low-income regions, so regions, NUTS-2 lagging regions with GDP per capita lower than 50% of the European Union average. And the second type of lagging regions was made by low-growth regions, so regions with lower than 90% of the EU average, and at the same time, regions that have not been able to converge in terms of income level to the European Union average. So we do build our taxonomy based on these two classifications, and we do scale these at the NUTS-3 level. So specifically, we propose a kind of two-sided taxonomy that that captures both the income side, the income level, and the long-run growth rate to capture the growth capacity of the region over pretty much long time period. We are covering something like 15 years time frame. So in terms of income level, we do consider the average GDP per capita over the period 2003-2017, and we do use the same thresholds used by the cohesion policy classification to split regions as high income, transition, less developed, and low income. And we do identify the low income regions as the first group of lagging regions we are interested in, according to the Catching Up initiative. The second step is to put together also the long-run growth rate criteria. So we do split regions according to GDP per capita growth between the years 2003 and 2017, and we do split regions as high and low growth places, with high growth places being those with GDP per capita growth rate greater than or equal than 50% of our sample average, and low growth regions are those with, of course, the GDP per capita growth rate lower than 50% of the sample average. The key point is that in doing this, we are considering our sample average rather than the EU average, but notice that, and I'm going to be clearer on this in a few, that our sample covers 98.5% of the EU28 territory. So essentially, we are covering all NUTS-3 regions, but 20 Polish NUTS-3 regions. So we are the bias that we do have in our sample average is very small. Okay, it's not so relevant for our goal. So we do end up with two types of lagging regions at the NUTS-3 level. The first one is made by low-income regions. The second one is made by not high-income regions that are also low-growth regions. So we are able to somehow reflect the Catching Up initiative, but with a higher level of details in terms of possible regional profiles in order to compare how different types of NUTS-3 regions are doing in terms of economic growth and economic performance. So in this map, we do have the spatial distribution of NUTS-3 regions according to our two-sided taxonomy. And what emerges quite clearly is that there's a lot of variation within NUTS-2 regions. Again, here we do have as solid black lines NUTS-2 borders, and we do have that in countries like Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Greece. So the Mediterranean area, we do have a lot of heterogeneity in terms of NUTS-3 regions within the same NUTS-2 regions. But this story is true also when we look at countries such as France or Germany or the UK. So we'll say top performing countries, rich countries in the European Union, okay, where we do find that within the same NUTS-2 region, there's the coexistence of different profiles of NUTS-3 regions, rich and poor one, fast and slow growing ones, okay? Well, interesting when we look at post-2004 enlargement countries, then there is much less heterogeneity except for very few cases that can be spotted somewhere. But these countries are more or less made by low income but high growth regions. So poor regions, but they're doing pretty much well in terms of economic growth and convergence. So the second step of the empirical analysis is essentially to take this taxonomy, to take this classification and to use it to analyze correlates of growth across different regional profiles, okay? We do focus on three main economic growth drivers, namely industrial structure, innovation, and inward foreign direct investments. And we do this for essentially three main reasons. So first one, these are key economic growth factors. These have been highlighted as key economic growth factors by previous literature. Second point, these are three-dimensional economic dimensions that can be influenced directly by local policymaker through ad hoc policy interventions. So a policymaker can decide to stimulate and to be more to make its own region more attractive for foreign companies, may decide to promote innovation capacity of firms or to stimulate a particular industrial sector in the own region. And third motivation, just to be a bit more practical, when we look at NUTS-3 regions, there's a lot of data and a lot of variables that are indeed available from Eurostat, so forth and so on. When we look at NUTS-3 regions, the availability of data and variables reduces quite a lot. Okay, so these are variables, these are economic dimensions for which we are able to gather NUTS-3 level data for pretty much long time period. So as I was saying, we end up with a sample of 1,321 NUTS-3 regions. This sample, I mean, we excluded a priori French overseas departments and autonomous cities of Ceuta and Melilla. So our sample covers 98.5% of the EU28 territory. So essentially, we are covering NUTS-3 regions in all EU member states entirely, except for Poland, because we were not able to find full data for 20 regions. So I was saying our classification can work when we look at the European Union level, when we try to make this classification not just an empirical exercise, but something like a policy tool, because we are indeed covering entirely the European Union. So what we do empirically is, as I was saying, we estimate a very simple economic growth equation, where the dependent variable is yearly GDP per capita growth, so GDP per capita grow between times t and t minus 1, and we do regress this on GDP per capita times t minus 1, a variable capturing population dynamics in a region between t and t minus 1, a proxy for agglomeration captured by employment density, a set of variables capturing the industrial structure of the region, proxied through the share of GVA in the different industrial sector, specifically agriculture, industry, construction, market services, and non-market services. We do capture innovation through patents, the number of patents filled by residents in a region per 100,000 inhabitants, and we do capture inward FDI through the number of investments set up in a region through per 100,000 inhabitants, plus region fixed effects and time fixed effects and the usual error term. So what we do is to take this empirical equation and to estimate it for the different profiles of regions that we have identified through our taxonomy. And then we also focus a bit more in detail on our two types of lagging regions, so the low-income ones and the not high-income, low-growth ones. And we try to disentangle a bit more the role that inward investment can play in these places. So we do replace this inward FDI variable, considering a categorical dimension, a categorical variable that captures essentially the different business activities, the different activities that have been run in a particular region by the multinational company, if of course an investment has been set up. And we do focus on 5 main activities, so headquarter-related activities, innovation-related activities, production, logistics, distribution, and transportation, and finally marketing and sales. So we try to disentangle a bit the role of foreign companies in lagging regions. So let's move to the analysis and the empirical results. But before looking at estimates, it would be good to come back to the idea that lagging regions are kind of a widespread phenomenon in the EU. Indeed, if we take the definition of lagging regions, and our definition of lagging regions, our two types of lagging regions are essentially the two types of lagging regions identified by the European Commission. So we are quite close to the policy world in this. Well, these places at the NUTS-3 level can be spotted in 19 out of 28 member states. And as we were seeing before in the map, those countries include also France, Germany, and the UK, so rich countries, okay, in Europe. But if we look at NUTS-2 level, we are not able to spot lagging regions in all these countries. Usually lagging regions at the NUTS-2 level are included in Mediterranean places and Eastern European countries. So we're highlighting something more by looking at a lower geographical scale. If we then look at low-income regions, well, these represent 16% of NUTS-3 regions overall, and this is a huge number, okay? But these low-income regions are lagging ones, but are also the places that are somehow behaving the best. So if we look at the dynamics of GDP per capita averaged by category, and we do consider the different income levels, well, the red dashed line here refers to low-income regions. These places are doing pretty much well. There's a positive trend over time in GDP per capita. Okay, they are growing quite a lot, and they're growing more than the other regions in the other categories. And particularly, those low-income regions that are lying in the bottom 10% of their own category are doing the best. What about the low-growth regions? Well, these overall represent 13% of NUTS-3 regions, which is, again, quite a large number. And these low-growth regions are doing pretty much bad. They are recording kind of flat dynamic in terms of income, in terms of GDP per capita over time, and the not high income low-growth regions, so the second type of lagging regions we are interested in, are those places that are probably doing the worst. So looking at the empirical results, well, this is kind of a huge table, so I'm not going into detail talking about each individual coefficient, but I would like just to give you the key insight of the analysis. That is, if we do compare different types of regions, okay, regions with different economic profiles and different economic growth capacity, and we do look at the same economic growth determinants, well, these factors are related to economic growth in a very different way. So here we do have regions by income level, so high income, transition, less developed, and low income ones, so the lagging ones. If we do compare columns 1 to 4, we do see that different economic growth factors are influencing economic growth in very different way. So just to give an example, if we look at the internal industrial structure of a region, this seems to matter despite in different ways, but this seems to be a key factor in shaping economic growth in high income regions, transition regions, but also, even though to a lower extent, also in less developed regions. Well, this does not seem to be a key factor for economic growth in low-income regions, where instead a positive population dynamics, agglomeration, so large urban areas, innovation and inward FDI seems to be the most important factors driving economic growth, and particularly investments by foreign companies in production activities and logistics, distribution, and transportation activities. Okay, you can look at here. And the point is that the same story is true when we look at the long-run rate taxonomy. Okay, so we do compare high income and not high income regions, and we do compare high and low growth regions. So here the key, our interest is more on the not high income low growth regions, as these are those lagging places that defined again by the European Commission in 2015. But again, the story is there. Different economic growth factors are driving economic growth in different types of regions in a quite different way. And if we look to the not high income low growth regions, well, we do see that key economic growth are agglomeration again. In this case, we do find some positive effect for a construction sector, and then again, innovation. And then even though with very marginal statistical significance, also exporter-related activities run by a multinational company, but this is really marginally significant, okay? And just to convince you even more about the role of heterogeneity when we want to analyze economic growth and we want to understand how policy, the role that policy can play to push economic growth, to push economic convergence, here we do have just a snapshot of estimates for the two types of lagging regions, of the low income and the low growth ones, by splitting within these two categories between rural versus urban areas. And again, we do find that what works in urban areas does not work in rural areas within the same type of regions. So again, the story is that there's a lot of heterogeneity that policymakers should exploit in order to understand how to design intervention strategies. So just, well, again, these results are pretty much robust to a variety of robustness tests, controlling for traditional growth determinants that are, for example, physical capital and human capital, despite being at the NUTS-3 level, because we do not have data at the NUTS-3 level on these two dimensions, controlling for heterogeneity and autocorrelation at country level, controlling for spatial spillover effects across regions. So, I mean, everything stayed there, so we're pretty much confident about our estimates. And the key story, again, is that different types of regions are characterized by different economic growth pathways. So the story, if you want to move, and I'm moving now to the policy side, leaving Austin again talking to you. Well, the story is that one-size-fits-all approaches to policy design, to defining funds for economic growth are highly likely to be ineffective, okay? But another key point of our results is that overall, they contribute somehow shedding light to the shortcomings of cohesion policy in reducing inequality across territories, across regions. And the possible explanation is that if we look at cohesion policy, if the definition of cohesion funds look at snatched regions, well, it's just looking at two large regions, two highly heterogeneous regions, okay, where we can spot different types of NUTS regions. So it could be that cohesion policy does not target the NUTS region, which is pretty much rich, but within these NUTS regions, we do have both rich and poor NUTS regions. And the same is true when we look at lagging NUTS regions, so regions that are indeed benefiting from cohesion policy, but within lagging NUTS regions that can be both rich and poor NUTS regions. So there could be something like accidental winners, okay? But accidental winners are such that inequality is going to increase among NUTS regions. So this is just food for thought about cohesion policy, about how policy can work and the shortcomings related to policy design. And I will now leave again the floor to Austin to move to the policy side of the paper.
Great. John, how are we doing on time? I think we've got a couple of minutes left.
Yeah, a couple of minutes would be good. Thanks.
Great. Okay. All right. So final two slides that we've got here are on potential policy implications. And this is kind of, you know, I think this is one of the most interesting things to discuss. That in a sense we've sort of presented the data, but everyone is going to take a different interpretation from it. So we're going to say what we think are three main policy implications, and people may have others or may question these as well. So number one, about managing expectations amongst policymakers about what could be achieved in different types of regions. I think it's fair to say that there is quite often a pressure, when you're in a region that is wondering about how to pursue economic development, to look to the real success cases, and they're quite often high income regions, so let's look at, this region or this one, and let's see if we can emulate that and so on. I think what this analysis shows is that we have to take the idea of transition seriously. So there were different growth correlates in different income levels and growth rates of regions. And if you want to be realistic about what you can achieve in your region, you may have to think about what tend to be the correlates of growth in similar types of regions. And they may be very different from the correlates of growth in high income or high growth regions. So you as a regional policymaker or as a local policymaker, yes, you may get there. But when you're hunting around for what's realistic in your type of region, let's look at regional peers. So this is one potential takeaway, and I think people may have other takes on this, which I think could be really interesting to discuss. Second here is about alerting national policymakers about the internal heterogeneity within NUTS-2 regions. So I think we made the case on a number of slides about how NUTS-2 regions hide lagging NUTS-3 regions, and there can be quite a lot of heterogeneity within NUTS-2 regions in general. So the policy implication of this is not only that we should be concerned about lagging NUTS-3 regions, but then we need to think about what to do about it. And in some sense, it's almost a paradox that you have a lagging NUTS-3 region on the doorstep of a faster growing or higher income NUTS-3 region. So then we come to this question about how to link And that may be more difficult than it sounds. So would we think about transport infrastructures to make it easier for people to commute to jobs and new opportunities? Would it be about accessibility of neighboring markets, helping firms connect, and participate in supply chains in leading areas? So I think here we would need to look at really what the constraints are and why we do see these divisions within NUTS-2 regions. And then thirdly, third potential policy implication is that we're beginning to see quite some concern about inequality as a source of discontent. I think you've probably seen quite, a number of working papers coming out recently, both from the EC and from researchers elsewhere, including in the LSE, where Roberto used to be based, about the importance of inequality for discontent. And now we can see that inequality is really quite strong and rising at the NUTS-3 level. So this could be potentially important. So far, we've looked at those researchers have looked at analysis at the NUTS-2 level, but here we're seeing that inequality in some sense is high and rising at the NUTS-3 level. What about further research? So just final thoughts on this. One thing that I would find really interesting to see is how some NUTS-3 regions have achieved a turnaround. So these are ones that were previously lagging and are now growing very fast. What do they do? What happened? So we've shed some light on that because we've looked at the correlates of growth. So we know what growth looks like in those types of regions, as Roberto presented. But we may need to have more qualitative evidence about low growth regions in particular. They're now the main barrier to EU convergence. There could be studies of turnaround pathways for similar regions rather than lagging regions in general. So focusing particularly on low growth regions, they're the ones really in a trap. And then we would love to have looked at the relationship between firm size and regional growth, but we couldn't do that because data just wasn't available when we looked at the Eurostat data set. Particularly about, for example, the contribution of large firms versus small firms for growth. I think we're all conscious that policymakers often focus on SMEs and startups and so on, but we would be interested in testing that empirically to see what the association between firm size and growth was in different types of region. Thank you very much. So hope we can have some discussion. Thanks, John.
Right. Thanks very much, Austin, Roberto. There's so much food for thought there that it's difficult to know where to start. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points which you mentioned and said were you interested in comments. I mean, the trend data that you presented sort of fits very much with other sort of EU and OECD analysis about that over the long term, there's been a convergence of poorest countries and poorest regions, which was interrupted by the crisis. And then what we saw is a certain recovery up that's been underway, but limited. And of course, extending the data by another couple of years, one would expect to see a potentially greater increase in inequality again. Particularly within countries, which I think has been the key story that we've seen in recent years. And it would be interesting to explore why that is. I think the point you made about the volume of cohesion policy is really important, because there are questions then about the degree to which it's achieving its purpose of cohesion, particularly within countries. You're mentioning the emphasis placed on territorial investment, which is true, but certainly under the heading of integrated territorial investment in the 2014 to 20 period, this has been a relatively small part of percentage of funding in many programs. And arguably what you've been saying underscores what people like Andres Rodriguez Pose have been saying for a while about the insufficient place-based focus of cohesion policy, particularly the degree to which the program is the unit of if you like, of policy thinking, and a lack or insufficient sub-regional attention in terms of how and where funding is implemented. Now, part of that in quite a number of countries is a lack of capacity and subnational governance structures. And perhaps we can come back to that. And I think our concern must be that the increasing prescriptiveness of the way in which cohesion policy is implemented and that sort of top-down decision-making about how decisions are made on resource allocation will increase. We've recently done a blog on how national recovery plans, which are adding a very significant volume of additional investment in the EU, are giving insufficient attention to cohesion. However, what you say at the end is important about what are valid and feasible policy prescriptions in response to the findings, what would work, what will work. And perhaps I think that ties in with a question that Bojida Ivanov, I hope I've pronounced your name correctly, has posed in the chat. Would you like to pose your question directly to Austin and Roberto?
Hi, everybody. I hope you hear me. That's why I actually included the comment in the chat, because I think it's easier not to waste enough time. And I have a separate question, which we can maybe discuss later. Okay.
I think the key point about your question was the effectiveness of the use of cohesion policy funds, which is a comment. But do you want to pose your question as well, and then we can give Austin and Roberto a chance to respond to both?
Yes, sure. My question was related to the demographic development and the indicator that you mentioned, which is a dummy indicator. This wasn't very clear, and since my research is focused on population decline, I'm particularly interested if you have established any causal links, although they've been already confirmed in other studies as well, but some sort of interrelations between declining population regions and and lower rates in your rating.
Well, yeah, you're right. Thanks for the point. That's a dummy variable, that captures essentially whether a region has recorded a kind of positive population change with respect to a negative population change. This is not really population dynamics because it's just a 1 year change, so it's very short run. But the science stays there if you consider a change in population. So the log change of populations enough. I mean, in terms of results, nothing changes. We did not test for long run changes in population, so we did not analyze the kind of relationship between demographic path and economic growth path in detail. So a kind of long run story in terms of, okay, I'm going to face a kind of demographic transformation over 10 to 20 years and see what happens in terms of long run economic growth. So we didn't do this at all. So we just capture some kind of dynamics in terms of population, just to capture changes in the size and the human capital that is somehow available eventually in the region.
Okay, thanks very much, Roberto. Bojida, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, maybe just my point of view based on also on other data and based on my research and also my experience as a Bulgarian, the most quickly depopulating country, is basically that the human capital dynamics that you mentioned that you tried to capture just with a change in population from one year to another might actually influence the conclusions a little bit, because I think long-term depopulating regions with aging population throughout years and years, even after EU accession, which is the case of most of the regions in Bulgaria, are actually suffering a lot all the negative consequences that were already mentioned, lack of investment, lack of endogenous potential, etc. So yeah, just something to further think about. I think it's also important to consider the long-term development from demographic point of view.
Yeah, you're perfect. Like something that can be seen also in the US when we look at regions in the US, those places that are facing kind of historical decline in population are those that are now lagging behind. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Thanks for the suggestion.
Okay, thanks very much. Austin, anything you want to add to that?
I think maybe just to share the experience that I've had in Croatia, which is sort of the manifestation of the dilemma that is picked up in one or two of the comments, John, that you made, and also in the chat as well. So I think the dilemma is, if you have, if you're a national policymaker and you see that you've got a range of regions in your country, some of which are leading and some of which are lagging, as we pointed out, and we can establish through the paper that the correlates of growth when growth occurs are different in each type of region. And then you still have the dilemma about what to do about it, and whether, John, as you said, whether we need more kind of place-based efforts, presumably in those lagging regions, as Božidar was pointing out, that the funds are concentrated in already developed regions. So, a strong argument could be made that is appropriate. So some people would argue that yes, that's the best way to do it. Let's place our bets in regions that are already growing well and are high income, and they can further grow and pull up the rest of the country. But I think I guess what we're showing in this analysis is that doesn't seem to be the case, that inequalities are rising. Yet, there is still some difficulty in thinking, when you've got a lagging region, how to focus your investments so that you would prompt growth. So, what I'm saying is we have this dilemma about what to do, what to do about it. So, as a policymaker looking at this analysis, the path forward is still not clear. So the possibly different types of evidence that you would need to make those decisions. And I think that's, that to me is one of the interesting parts of working in development, that we've now got better evidence about what's going on in different types of regions, but there's still quite some difficulty in deciding what to do about it.
Okay, thanks very much, Austin. We've got two questions or comments, first from Serafin Passos Vidal and then from Despina Alexiadou. Serafin, your point follows nicely on from what Austin was just saying.
Well, just to say that I vividly know from my own experience how difficult it is. I mean, it's not a question of finding the problem; it's a question of the politics around this. It so happened that I was the one who wrote into the ERDF regulation the definition of demographically declining areas at NUTS-3 level, and because it was an NUTS-3 level, it was a real struggle to actually get the co-legislators to actually approve that, and that's why, while you are absolutely right that that's in many cases the right spatial level to target support and to define policy approaches, I'm very skeptical for that experience. There will be willingness, particularly at regional level, to actually do these more spatial targeted things. And I wish to be proven wrong, but definitely the experience I had in this negotiation has not been encouraging in that respect. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Serafin. Despina?
Yes, thank you. So I'm at the School of Government and Public Policy here at the University of Strathclyde. Very nice presentation, thank you, very interesting. And I wanted to touch upon some of your conclusions and your main findings. So one of what I thought was striking was that construction was the one area that seemed to have impacted positively growth in the low growth areas or the low income regions. And I wonder what that means, right? So the story is that the inequality has been growing. So if we take these two facts together, are we saying that actually construction is not, you know, the right way to go forward, or why are the other you know, why does FDI not work? So I find the conclusions in a way inconclusive, but that's the nice thing about the research. And so the main question then is there a way for you to identify not just short-term immediate growth, but longer-term growth? So are there any kind of, yes, economic activities or investments where we could say, oh, well, this kind of investment, construction or not, actually had a sustained growth over time than something that's just a boom and bust? And it just raised a lot of questions to me. How is it defined? Who is behind it? Is this private or public? Is it just a very kind of short-term thing to lift these regions out of poverty? Anyway, that's one thing. Kind of broader issue, and as you move forward with your research, I was wondering if you have considered the legacies of economic production in these low growth areas. So can you actually, you know, a former mining region, you know, what kind of interventions does it take? Now, of course, that's a huge discussion, but again, in terms of your, since you pitch your work as having implications for policy, to what extent do legacies matter?
Okay, thanks very much for those questions. Austin or Roberto, would you like to respond?
Roberto, do you want to go first, or?
Okay, yeah, thanks for the question. When we need to translate something that is just estimated to policy, let's say suggestions, well, here comes the tricky part, okay? Well, in our mind, the goal is probably a bit more general. I mean, let's first say that imitation strategies, this kind of approaches that quite often policymakers take, may not work, simply because regions are different. And our analysis as a first step was just to show that these differences exist, and these differences are quite huge if we move to very small places and very different places. And this is the first part. The second part is, okay, let's try to take something nice to translate into policy making from our results. Well, the story is that, okay, we're identifying just some of the many factors that are growth enhancing, that may drive economic growth, that can overall influence economic performance and long-run economic growth. If you pick that coefficient on construction for, it was, I don't remember, probably low-income regions, okay, good. This seems just a story about, okay, maybe if you want to improve a bit more economic growth, let's try to put more emphasis, let's try to increase jobs in those sectors, for example, construction activities that are creating more jobs, that are creating more economic value, and through this, increasing economic growth. Keep in mind that this is a short-run analysis, it's 1 year growth rate. So of course, I will not speculate saying that from this, I can tell you how much a region can grow in 10 to 20 years. Of course, it would be a bit of too much speculation, this, okay? But it's just a starting point. In terms of legacy, if I got your point correctly, you were referring to a story about the tradition of the tradition of regions in terms of their endogenous capacity, in terms of their traditional industrial structure. So you were talking probably, your idea was related somehow to those specific assets that make a region what the region is right now. There's, of course, another story. There's a story that is highly related to policy, European policy, where we think to smart specialization strategies. So the idea of putting a lot of effort and investing all resources in those specific assets, making a region what a region is. There's, of course, another story. This is another ingredient when we talk about economic growth, something that we're not able to pick empirically, or well, we can pick it empirically if we, again, come back to the NUTS-3 level of analysis, because trust me, it's been really hard to collect data for 15 years at NUTS-3 level, because these data are not really viable. So again, there's always a trade-off in terms of details of analysis you want to go in, and the geographic scale you want to consider, time frame you want to consider. So yeah, we try just probably to give kind of snapshot of what is going on, what has gone on recently in the last 20 years, 15 years, but trying to focus, to zoom at the geographical level at least, highlighting that there are some problems characterizing cohesion policy, but I will not say just cohesion policy, characterizing the approach that policymakers have in looking at these large regions, okay? That's the first part of the contribution, but I'll also leave the floor to Austin, just not to monopolize.
No, thank you. That's great. Thanks.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I think, Despina, you're right to point out that the picture is, is not fully clear, but that's really the, as Roberto outlined as well, that's kind of the point of the analysis, is to show that there seem to be multiple paths and no kind of overall pattern, but with a few exceptions. I mean, I did think it's quite interesting that in some types of regions, that there are sort of confirming results. So, for example, the role of inward FDI in low-income regions, that seemed to be associated with a growth premium, even when it was in activities which are not particularly sophisticated. To me, that's very interesting. I quite often find myself working in low-income regions, and to have this evidence that shows that, even if it's in logistics, transportation, distribution, that's where FDI is. That is still associated with positive effects in income. That's quite a useful result. But as you say, the picture is less clear in many other areas. So. Yeah, John, back to you.
Okay, thanks very much. We've gone past 12 o'clock, but are there any final questions? Odd Godal, you posted a comment in the
it's more. My question is basically: is there an east-west dimension to growth? From the map side, there seems to be that, and then if there is a particular reason for that, is it basically a legacy issue that Eastern countries are transforming from one political economic system to another, or is it other issues at play?
Okay, thanks very much, Odd.
Oh, are we looking at you're thinking of the multicolored map, the one with blues and reds and pinks and yellows and oranges? Is that the one? Oh, we can't hear you, but I'm assuming.
Yes, that's the map.
Yeah. I mean, just I love this map. I mean, I think it always seems to generate people sort of squinting at it and taking things away from it. And yeah, I mean, for me, there's clearly an east-west dimension there. That I think that tends to be because the new entrants to the EU tend to enter at a lower income rate, isn't it? So essentially you're seeing the colors there are oranges and reds as in the low income group. But there are several other conclusions that I think or observations that I think you can make there. These patterns in the UK and France that seem to be shared, but quite different from the ones in Germany. So, even within, as it were, the West, there's some quite different dynamics going on. And then also in Southern Europe, looking at the colors in Portugal, Spain, Southern Italy and Greece, that you've got a number of different patterns there. So yeah, I think there are many ways to use this map, but for me it really makes it quite stark. The different sort of sets of problems that are faced by different parts of the EU. Yeah. Roberto, I don't know if you have any comments as well.
Oh, well, it's true. There's kind of east-west divide, but this is a standard EU15 post 2004 enlargement countries. And then there are some traditional, and this comes back to the previous point about legacy, there are some traditional divides, just East-West Germany, North-South Italy. And this is true, this is legacy, this is something, I mean, I can talk about Italy, we can come back to in, I don't know, more than 150 years, but the story is there. We can come back to pre-unitary Italy, and there is a divide as well. So it's something that I don't think that cohesion policy or policymakers, national ones, European ones, or I don't know, the OECD can do about it. This is really a legacy. This is part of the history of the country. This is something related to culture. This is something related to bureaucratic efficiency, something related to a variety of this is, I mean, a story about a variety of ingredients that made the countries what the countries now they are, okay, and the different parts of the countries what they now are, okay. But as Austin was saying, there's not just a story about East-West. Okay, we know that Eastern Europe is growing much faster than Western Europe, but this is really the beta coefficient story about solo. This is convergence model. I mean, it's just it's the standard approach, and probably this was the idea in the mind of policymakers when they started to put money in those places. Okay, but then the nice story, as Austin was saying as well, is that we can see a lot of variety in northern Italy. We can see a lot of heterogeneity in France. We can see a lot of heterogeneity in Spain, and that's the problem. I mean, we are putting money in Eastern countries, and they are low income, but they are growing quite a lot because those are places that are low income, that are poor, but are fast growing. But then we are now losing all the western part of the country, not just southern Italy, but also places in northern Italy that is traditionally a highly industrialized area. Okay, kind of a motor of Central Europe put together with Germany and France. And that's the tricky point. I mean, this is the key story, okay? And just, I don't know, this, I mean, this clarifies the point.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much, both. I'm reluctant to bring this to a close because it's so interesting, but we've already lost half a dozen participants as we've gone beyond the hour. So perhaps we can bring it to a close. I think the discussion has brought out some really interesting points. I mean, one is the scope for contextualizing some of the findings by reference to specific regions in context, and particularly looking at where exactly are the different categories of, for example, declining rural regions, growing rural regions, and so on, and trying to understand where what the differences are. And Božidar has referred to some of that, for example, in the chat with reference to Bulgaria. Secondly, the scope for introducing a couple of more data sets, one being, the European Commission has done some really valuable work on building up historical data sets on cohesion policy spending. And, the work we've done in EPRC for the Commission has shown how the differences between explicit strategies and implicit strategies, and that when you look at where the expenditure is going geographically and thematically, you get some really interesting contrast with what programs say they're actually doing. But that's one. And another data set is on quality of government and opening up this whole area of administrative capacity. And you mentioned some of the demands of micro level or more micro level targeting, but as Serafine has pointed out, there are some real challenges there. Just one point on the lack of Polish data. You might speak to the Center for Regional Local Studies, Euroreg, at Warsaw University, who might at least be able to help with some sort of proxies on that. But but I'm sure there are many other avenues that you've already got in mind in developing this really interesting analysis. So thank you very much, Austin, and thank you, Roberto, for your contributions. And indeed, thank you to everyone for your participation and interest and contributions. Just a reminder that our next webinar will take place on Wednesday, the 24th of June, when Diana Morales, a postdoc at Karlstad University in Sweden, will present on smart specialization strategies in peripheral regions. Do contact us to register for our mailing list and to keep up to date on future events. Please do tweet or otherwise disseminate your interest in this and other seminars. Thanks again, everyone. We hope to see you again. Take care and goodbye. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, John.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.